Hey everybody, Chalkboard History, Volume 2.
There's a lot of slapping, a lot of hitting going on.
Same thing as before.
It's very chaotic.
We're filming our second episode today. You don't like that? You don't even know what that is, do you? This is not Journey. This is Steve Perry on his own. Play this for Catherine. She'll melt.
Oh no, I have to hear this song a lot. This is the song that her parents danced to at their wedding. I'm reminded of it all the time.
I mean, there you go.
It should be gone.
Monuments.
It should be gone forever.
Monuments, mistakes, etc. Monuments, mistakes, interpretation, etc. Monuments, mistakes, interpretation, memory, etc.
Sure. A title that goes on forever.
So, which monument do you want to start with?
I think we just talk about monuments in general, like when they're put up.
A long time ago.
Galaxy
far away.
Yeah, can't say a long time ago around here. Yeah, not without that coming up. So I think...
There he stands like a stone wall.
Oh, we're going to talk about that one, because that's a good one.
That's a good one.
I mean, Stonewall Jackson.
He does sort of look like Arnold Schwarzenegger.
It looks like they got Schwarzenegger to pose for the statue. And then they gave the horse some steroids, too, because that thing is just... That horse is beefy.
Jackson's like 150 pounds probably, and he looks like he's a linebacker.
Solid muscle.
All right, so what are we doing?
So I think, talk about when the monuments were put up. I think, post-war, there's the effort on battlefields to memorialize, and then in the South, there's the efforts to erect monuments during the Lost Cause period. And then for the veterans of the Grand Army of the Republic in northern states, there was their effort to try and remember their fallen comrades at GAR Post. But all of them pay tribute back to the men who had fought in the American Civil War.
This might be a good template to kick things off. I was telling a group, the American Battlefield Trust crowd last week, I asked a question. The greatest resistance during the 1890s and early 20th century to Confederate monumentation beyond the units that were there, meaning the greatest opposition to the Lees and the Forrests and the Davises, etc., being plastered all over national parks was who?
Veterans.
Right. The Grand Army of the Republic were opposed to this on a very broad front. So it's why you end up seeing a lot of monuments versus being in the national parks. They end up in the public squares. That's why Forrest is splattered all over the South, as well as Davis. Like New Orleans, you end up with a Lee and Davis statue there, Lee and Davis statues, as well as poor Pierre Beauregard, who I've said many times is like collateral damage. The Lee Monument at Gettysburg is not part of the original park. It's added later on. So how about, let's start with Jackson, first major battle of the war.
Yeah.
And the Jackson Monument Memorial statue is put up when?
I don't know.
Because Manassas isn't saved till the 20s.
Yeah. It's a later addition to all the national parks. And so I imagine that monument sometime right around the infancy stages of the park.
But the theme of the monument isn't just that Jackson and his men
were there,
cool and were there. It is it's sort of like a Gods and Generals memorial on the battlefield. Because there's debate among people, and has been for a long time, that the whole, there he stands like a stone wall wasn't a compliment. It was Barnard Bee complaining that Jackson was dragging his feet and not moving into the fight. But you would never know that by looking at that memorial or sometimes going to various meetings or going to online forums, let alone watching a movie where Jackson is depicted as the flawless hero.
Yeah, and I think that the monument is, and that's the other thing too to consider. If you gave that template, I think another one to consider is why were monuments put up and what are they supposed to show us? What are they supposed to tell us? That monument of Stonewall Jackson at Manassas is supposed to tell us that he is this flawless superhero that apparently has really, really, really great biceps and incredible chest pecs. Like, that is the only thing that we would know looking at that statue, because then the story behind it becomes, well, Stonewall Jackson was so great, he was such a hero, and then they were able to stand in this position, and he stood here like a stone wall, and look at him, he's immovable, he's this immovable object. And when you start to actually get into who Jackson was, I think he's like 5'9", a little bit more than 140 pounds.
It was unveiled in 1940.
Okay, so not that long after the park.
Right, but it wasn't there at the beginning, and 40 years is a long time after the war. So I think I remember, looking at it on several occasions and thinking, well, I'm not really sure what the goal here is, but if nothing else, Jackson is there as a Stonewall hero. And, to fast forward, Jackson, I've said this a number of times, that Jackson's entire aura is built on First Manassas, the Shenandoah Valley, and Chancellorsville, and his death. Jackson had many episodes where he really wasn't all that good.
7 days.
Right. It's terrible in 7 days, which makes him a lot like other commanders. He had his moments of great success and great failures. But no doubt Jackson is one of, he's like one of the members of the Holy Trinity for
Lee Davis and Jackson.
Lee Davis and Jackson.
The three of them, you've got it.
Who's the Holy Spirit in that?
I feel like it has to be Lee. I don't know.
All right, so let's just briefly talk about the two in New Orleans, Jackson and Davis and Lee. So what was it like? You lived there when they were removed.
It was a strange time. It was following 2015. And that was the killings in Charleston. And then the monuments weren't removed until 2017.
And what were they, of course, meant to depict in New Orleans?
So for Lee, the Lee Memorial Association, when it was formed in the 1870s after his death, was supposed to pay tribute to the chieftain of the Army of Northern Virginia, of which, if you look at New Orleans after the war, you can't go anywhere or shake a dead cat without hitting a former Confederate.
And what about Davis?
Davis dies in New Orleans.
Right.
And he's there a lot throughout that period, but he becomes both of them become memorialized. In fact, one of the members of the Memorial Association was John Bell Hood and Braxton Bragg. Fun, just to throw them in there. But those monuments are put up in the 1870s and the 1880s. And then by 2017, the city of New Orleans removed both monuments, and there was intense fighting in the streets, fighting in City Hall, screaming, shouting matches. I remember going into work one day, and there was like a hate group rally at Lee Circle, and that's what they had become in that kind of 2 and 3 month process in between when the removals were announced and when they were actually removed. Was they just became a place where if you wanted to see violence, that was where you would go. And then it just got to the point where it was just exhausting because it was all that was in the news. It was all that anybody was talking about in kind of the Civil War circles. And I think that really when you hear people today talk about how, cities all across the country are just destroying monuments and they're taking things down, it's like they're watching the same 5 clips over and over and over.
Right, or they say
and 3 of them are coming from New Orleans.
They're erasing history, or whatever the catchphrase is.
I've always argued though that the Lee and the Davis monuments were Lee, Davis, and certainly the Beauregard. Beauregard probably the least problematic of the 3 of those.
Right, because he's from there.
Right, the 3 of those, I guess, made sense. The one that was always one that was I may have had complicated feelings towards the other 3. The one that needed to come down was the Liberty Place Monument. Battle of Liberty Place in 1874 is a White League mob attempting to overthrow the gubernatorial election of Louisiana and then establish essentially white rule out of New Orleans. They fight the Integrated Metropolitan Police Force commanded by James Longstreet.
Hold on. So commanded by James Longstreet.
A Republican.
Who's already become a pariah before his own death in Confederate circles. And this is why I've said on many occasions, there's a whole list of Confederate officers. Try and find monuments to those men anywhere in the South.
Yeah.
So
Longstreet's next to impossible.
Right. Just like Hood, just like Bragg. I mean, the Joe Wheeler, I mean, you know, you can criticize them however you want, but there's a specific list of people who become representative of a just and righteous cause. And I can tell you as an outsider, I watched New Orleans, of course, for a long time, like I did Charlottesville. No matter what one thinks about Mitch Landrieu, when I heard him say that it is self-evident that these men did not fight for the United States, that is true. And I think that's one of the issues with those monuments in that place, because they were put up to represent, the side that lost the war. And if we are honest with ourselves, there were plenty of people who did not think that they fought for the right cause in that city and across the country, which goes back to my earlier point, why there's this massive opposition by those who actually fought the war to see those monuments put into national parks, because they become their own thing then. And they take on a life of their own, like Nathan Bedford Forrest.
Oh boy.
Who, when he died in 1877, was buried in, of all places, a cemetery. You know, remarkable that he would want to be buried in a cemetery. So his wife joins him many years later, and incredibly, Forrest's remains, he and Mrs. Forrest, were dug up. You know, I've heard people talk about it's grave desecration. Well, you might want to know the whole story before you start going down that road, because some group convinced Forrest's grandson that it was a good idea to dig their bodies up from where they wished to be buried, and then move them to another part of the city, in this case being Memphis, which Memphis and New Orleans are their own unique places of friction, progress, the past and the present clashing.
More friction, more progress.
You know, Ida B. Wells is in Memphis at the time talking about the outrages against the black community. Well, who better, you know, to use as the proverbial reminder about who was still in charge
than
Forrest, you know, Confederate general, slave owner, slave trader, Ku Klux Klan member. Dig him up. Bury him again, and put this massive monument, which, by the way, it was a beautiful monument and is now right here in our backyard down in Columbia at Elm Springs. But, you know, had Forrest been left in the cemetery, we wouldn't have had to go through any of these convulsions. And I think that's what some of the monuments, like Jackson, is secure. Jackson's not going anywhere because he's on a battlefield. You know, he's not stuck in the middle of... you know, a community forcing everyone to look at them as if they are people to be revered. Because isn't that what monuments are? These are people to be respected, commemorated, revered. These are our heroes. Well, I will say this and probably get some flack for it. I never looked at those people as my heroes. I also didn't look at them as my enemies, but I never looked on them with the same reverence that others did. And I think sometimes that's what people who defend them like they treat them all the same, is they never consider anybody else's perspective or the facts about situations related to how they went up or when they went up. So what else do we have about monumentation and memory and interpretation and what it all means today
I think
2023?
The battlefield monuments are an interesting discussion too, because they're put there by the veterans who are remembering in their own way their comrades, and they're remembering their role in a particular battle. So if you walk through, let's say, Vicksburg, because it's great for this, because there's entire avenues of just nothing but monuments and stone and bronze and granite. They're just everywhere.
Incredible park. Incredible.
Yes. But all of the monuments are raised by states or raised by veterans of those different regiments, and each of them tells their story. And their story might conflict with the monument that's right next to it. And so the problem that you run into with interpretation is, and we kind of reference this in our discussion of the movies with Gettysburg, is you can get the Joshua Chamberlain story, and you can get the Ellis Spear story right next to one another. And for you, the visitor who's just looking through monuments at that time, just looking to understand how things developed in a battle, you might not get the perfect understanding from it.
But what you don't get at a national park is you may get the heroism and bravery, and in addition to who was there and what the unit was and who commanded it. There's a place at Vicksburg where General John Adams actually has a bust. It's that like kind of, I don't know if it's a full circle, but it's at least
It's not far from like Confederate Avenue.
Francis Marion Cockrell is there. There's a whole slew of Confederate generals' busts. You don't get the sort of vindication of the cause. That's what you get outside of the national parks. That's what you get in the public space. And I think that's where the interpretation comes into conflict. Because I think the veterans were perfectly, for the most part, were content with explaining what had happened from a military perspective.
Yeah. I think, too, what's interesting is the early parks, that's certainly the case, but the later parks, I'm thinking about Shiloh and Manassas now that you brought it up.
Shiloh's early. Shiloh's one of the originals.
Is it?
Shiloh, Vicksburg, Gettysburg, Antietam, Chickamauga, Chattanooga.
Yeah. So then maybe the later monuments that are added to the parks, what I mean to say. Because the UDC monument at Shiloh is an interesting artifact all by itself.
It is. That's the one, actually. And you know who stands right next to the UDC monument? Jeff Davis.
Yeah.
There's actually a small Jeff Davis, almost life-size. Yeah, and that one actually stands...
Because that's 40s or 30s it's added. I don't remember.
It's a little like Lee. Lee is so just gargantuan at Gettysburg.
Yeah,
I mean...
the Virginia Memorial with Lee at the top.
With Lee at the top. Yeah. So it's a Lee.
Yeah.
I mean, he practically is halfway to heaven, you know, and I remember when, what's his name? Scott, oh my gosh, from Gettysburg. In just a few years ago, he stood...
Is it Hancock?
Scott Hancock, yeah, stood at the base of that statue with just a Black Lives Matter sign and was just, I mean, the screaming and the hollering from 50 or 60 or 70 people, and then the guys on motorcycles drowning him out, and all Scott was saying was, well, Black Lives Matter.
Yeah, at the base of the Lee Monument.
At the base of the Lee Monument at the Battle of Gettysburg. Yeah, and, you know, I think that the monuments, I guess I wouldn't have thought about this 20 years ago. But, you know, if you're willing to change, if you're willing to evolve and know that things around you are changing, and the veterans went through this, they understood the difference between 1855 and 1875. You know, like there was before the war and there was slavery, and then there was after the war and there wasn't slavery.
Yeah.
You know, one side won, one side lost. Monuments aren't all the same.
Right.
And they are not perceived by everyone the same way. And I think that's something that still troubles us. I still hear, and so we get a chance to engage people when they'll say things like, well, they are erasing history. And instead of trying to counter that argument, I've actually started to question, well, who are they? Because I'm curious, like, what is in the mindset of someone when they think about a monument? Let's say it's to Nathan Bedford Forrest. Well, they are erased. Well, who's they? Because I want to know, is the answer black people, young people, liberals, communists, you know, Marxists, you know, all the words we've heard. You know, who is they? Who is they in your mind? Because Forrest history is very secure. We will be dead, and no one will ever probably remember us except for our family. Forrest's legacy will live on. Hundreds of years from now, if there's still a United States, people will be talking about the Civil War and Nathan Bedford Forrest.
There's a great book, John Tracy and Chris Mikowski edited. It's Monuments in Memory. And it's just a series of essays. But one of the points that they make in the introduction is that removal of a monument does not justify or does not mean the removal of historical record. So just by seeing a statue come down doesn't mean that the person that's depicted in the statue no longer existed. And that's the point I think you made really, really well. I heard you say at one time is that you never looked at the statue of Nathan Bedford Forrest and felt like you learned anything about the man.
Never learned anything about him.
So his story, though, is still real. You still know about
What, he had a cool goatee or something? You know, and he rode a nice horse? Yeah, I learned nothing about him. I actually had to... pull out one of those to learn about him.
Yeah.
Or read his own memoirs. The other thing about monumentation and memory is something else that's happened in just recent years. And of course, it's easy to blame one president and hold up another, or blame this political party or whatnot. Is the change, the changing of army bases. I don't know that I told you this. This happened, I think, just last week. So we know that Fort Hood is among those being changed.
Yeah.
Right. So it is now named Fort Cavazos, first 4-star Hispanic general in the U.S. Army. A group of ladies were at one of the sites we manage. I won't say which because it doesn't matter. Nice ladies, 4 or 5 of them. They came in, they bought tickets, they were going to take a tour. They saw the Army command structure, and one of them said, "Oh, that's the guy the fort in Texas was named for, but they've changed it." And someone said, "Well, what did they change it to?" And do you know what the response was? "Well, it's not a normal name." And I thought, right, it's not like a white English name.
Yeah, not Fort Smith, not Fort Hood.
Fort Jones, Fort Hood.
Yeah.
It's not a normal name.
Yeah.
And I didn't say anything because what do you say? And I don't think that she meant anything prejudiced by it, but she clearly didn't think about what she said. That in the Cavazos family, that name isn't...
It's just a normal name.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And what I saw was what plagues us on a small level. And as I've said, and I've tried to give Hood, a fair shake around these parts, he's from Kentucky.
Yeah.
Like, he had no really good reason to abandon his oath to the U.S. Army, which then bleeds into conversations about where these men, did they commit treason? And I'm not a lawyer or a constitutional expert, so I'm not going to get into that, but one can have that conversation. And I know that there are just some people that don't want to have that conversation. They don't want to talk about it. How dare we say that? When it's interesting, because George Wagner certainly thought they committed treason. He used that word all the time. Lincoln called them insurrectionists.
Newspapers said traitors, treason.
Right. Lincoln called it
insurrection.
Treason, rebellion.
Yeah. Primary sources don't typically lie.
And that is, I think, maybe at the heart of this entire debate about an object representing someone, in this case a crayon child, isn't real. But it is, they've taken on a life of their own, and it is. I so wish I could live another 50 years to see what. So we just went through the 150th, right? That'd be 40 more years. I'll never make it 40 more years. To see the 200th anniversary. How will we view the war, I think would be interesting. But how do we view these monuments? And the one thing we've tiptoed around, maybe unintentionally, you know what we're talking about, right? Monuments to the men on one side. And the memory of those men on one side.
Yeah.
And how interpretation has maneuvered about those men from that one side.
It is always interesting to, even if you just say the word monuments, because one thing that I talk about on my battlefield tours is that there aren't really any monuments to the Battle of Franklin save for the staggered cannonballs. That's it. That's the only one.
Yeah.
And you say monuments, and you can watch people's hackles
and you know what?
Flare on that.
I would, if I could, because I was part of the group that put that thing there, we should remove it. That has no place on the battlefield because it's become like a Claiborne Memorial. And I know because I was part of this small group that figured it was something that people would identify as being on a Civil War battlefield. But they've turned it into something else. Sometimes I want to put a handwritten note on it and like tape it to it and say, this is not the Claiborne Memorial.
Yeah.
This is a generic pyramid of cannonballs that you'd see everywhere from Shiloh to Chickamauga. It is interesting how in the last 5 to 10 years, it's like we've traveled 30 or 40 years. The questioning of what the Confederacy really stood for, who were these men, because they weren't all the same. And although we can't prove this, I would guess that Robert E. Lee and Nathan Bedford Forrest and probably even Jeff Davis would be so puzzled by all of this. You know, the monuments we didn't talk about? And I mentioned this to a group last week, were the ones in Richmond. I never thought for a moment, because Richmond was, it was the capital, the Confederacy. I never thought that those monuments would come down, and the hows and whys that they came down, I think, is a case study of how people within a community can't even work together. Like, they just butt heads and call each other names all the time. But I of course only became aware of this in recent years, that when that area was annexed and the subdivision was built around it, that that the advertisement in the newspaper said that no Negro or person of African descent may own a home or rent a home. So they were forbidden.
Yeah.
It was a completely white-only community. But there were black sanitation workers. They had to go into that community and empty people's garbage cans, but they couldn't live there. So the Confederate monuments were in some ways representative of the same racial hierarchy that had led to the rebellion to begin with. Yeah. And I think that maybe 50 years from now, we will finally stop fighting about what it was at the heart of all of this. And, in the end, I think the heart of it was the United States going to survive, and was slavery going to continue? And those two things run on a parallel track. And I've tried many times to tell some of my friends on the other side of the spectrum, you are literally fighting a losing war. You've lost and you don't even understand. You cannot continue to... You can honor Confederate soldiers without honoring the cause. That's what we've done as a country with Vietnam. Those who died, died. But we've really had to reckon with what were we doing in the 1960s and 1970s. And there's still a group of people who insist that the cause was just, thus the monuments cannot be questioned, thus anybody who doesn't take that line of thinking is a Marxist, a liberal, a communist. They hate America, they're destroying history, and they will not win out in the end, because look at what's happened over the last 10 years. Now, thankfully, it's slowed down. I don't think that you go through these spasms where you do have kind of collateral damage in communities. But I think I tell this to people all the time. We encourage you to go visit these places and look at these monuments and reflect on what they mean. Reflect on, if you go to Jefferson Davis's home in Mississippi, what do you learn there?
All kinds of interesting little tidbits. It's a different total story.
But what do you learn about Jeff Davis there?
I don't know that... outside of what I've read about Davis, I don't know that I've ever walked away from Beauvoir learning anything more about Davis than maybe I knew before.
Right, which is what?
He was the president of the Confederacy, and he died in New Orleans, and he had a home in Gulfport.
So you don't learn really anything?
No, not really.
He's just an incidental character.
Yeah.
See, I think that's interesting.
Yeah.
Isn't the job of people...
Well, the story there is vastly different than what the truth would be, is that Davis was a great American constitutional lawyer and all these other things. He was a senator and secretary of war, which, of course, those things are true. But
nobody cares about Jeff Davis unless he's president of the Confederacy.
Yeah.
And that's somewhere I'm going. I'm leading questions. Is if you go to Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C., what do you learn? Well, you may not learn a whole lot, but you learn what he said at the Gettysburg Address, and you learn what he said in his second inaugural.
Yep.
Now, you may not pick up a lot, but that tells you something about what he said. And I think sometimes other places want to avoid what these people actually said.
Yeah, interestingly, there's no monument to Alexander Stevens with the Cornerstone speech written on it.
No.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah. And another good monument that I think we avoided but is interesting to talk about, and maybe it's a good one to close with, is the Wirtz Monument at Andersonville.
Oh my goodness, I can't believe you brought this up. You know, when I went to Andersonville the first time, it was the only place I've ever thought it was so forlorn and sad, and I left thinking Henry Wirtz got exactly what he deserved. Because ignorance and simply saying I was following orders is not an excuse.
Yeah.
It is absolutely not an excuse. And all you had to do is compare what happened at Andersonville to what happened at Cahaba in nearby Alabama. The death rates are not the same. Wirtz didn't care if those men were dying. He did nothing to alleviate their suffering. It wasn't that he let some men die. It's that he let thousands die who he might have otherwise saved. And he just, and they put the monument up to make him a hero. You've heard me say this. Find a King George III statue in the United States of America.
Well, the thing too is, like, when you look at that monument, you might walk away from that if you know nothing else, and you're just maybe an outsider visiting the United States, and you're going on all these National Park Service stops. If you walk across the street from Andersonville, because it is directly across the street, go across into America, so you walk through the town, you might come away with a different picture of Henry Wirtz in your mind than what is true. And that's the problem with saying that removal of monuments or not contextualizing monuments is destroying history. History isn't being presented by the monument, it's presented by the individual, but you have to know who the individual was.
I'll leave you and everyone with this final thought. Perhaps one of the greatest, most successful marketing campaigns ever was the Lost Cause. And what you said was people maybe from not in the country. I think those who architected the Lost Cause knew full well if they could say something was true, subsequent generations would never know it wasn't. And I think younger people today cannot be fooled because they have it right here. They don't have to go to a library. Society has evolved and changed greatly. And they know or can find out what others have masked and covered up for years. Because at the root of it was the destruction of the United States and the continuation of slavery. That's all you need to know. And then you can see that the two sides were fighting for quite altogether different purposes. I know that's very difficult for some people, but it's okay to accept the truth. Professor?
I got nothing. That's good.
Another fun episode of Chalkboard History.
Are we going on sabbatical?
I think we are. Actually, I think we're going to take the summer off. We've got a whole new series called Battlefield Bits that we're rolling out. We've got a couple of other ideas.
You have to say it the same way that you introduced it to me.
Battlefield Bits!
Battlefield Bits.
Battlefield Bits.
That's it.
Battlefield Bits, Wagner's line last night tripled overnight. Nice. The views went... So it got shared or picked up or something went crazy. But we put out one on Winstead Hill, speaking of Confederate monumentation, which I think is artfully done compared to other places, and some Wagner's line stuff. And we've got a whole list of things, shorter, quicker episodes. But yeah, we'll be back in the fall with more Chalkboard History. Thanks for watching.